want to thank everybody for coming here. We get to see this amazing full room, we get amazing authors, and we get to hear their storytelling. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Shannon McKenna Schmidt, talking about the First Lady of World War II.
Thank you, Aaron, for the introduction. I'd also like to thank a few other people, Jordan Schnitzer, Debbie Miller, and Jamie Kabler. As Aaron mentioned, JB found the First Lady of World War II while he was browsing at a bookstore, and he invited me to be here. And thanks so much to all of you for coming today. It's really wonderful and fun and an honor to be in such a community that just loves literature and books so much. And I'm excited to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt and to share a lesser-known side of her as an adventurer and a traveler, and to highlight the pivotal part that she played during World War II. The unique place that Eleanor occupied in the United States and in the world at that time can really be seen through the lens of her groundbreaking trip to the Pacific Theater. This story begins in August 1943, when Eleanor set out from New York City. Keeping a low profile to evade the media, she flew to San Francisco on a commercial flight, which at the time took about 20 hours and required 2 refueling stops. Once in San Francisco, Eleanor secretly boarded a military transport plane. And that plane, traveling under the code name Flight 321, left San Francisco bound for the Pacific Theater, where the United States had been battling Japan for nearly 2 years. Inside the plane, it was bare bones, it was loud and rumbling, it was unpressurized, and it was freezing cold. And Eleanor shared that space with supplies and sacks of mail. By the time Eleanor set out for the Pacific, she had been First Lady for a decade. She was famous for her travels, or infamous, depending on the perspective, and she constantly made headlines for them. When Eleanor entered the White House in 1933, the American public got a First Lady the likes of which they had never seen before. Traditionally, First Ladies stayed close to the White House, they primarily oversaw social functions, and they did not take an active part in public life. But at the time Eleanor became First Lady, she was already well established in her own right, as an educator, a political advocate, a writer, a speaker, and a traveler. Eleanor was an early advocate of commercial air travel at a time when it was thought that only the most courageous and athletic people were fit to fly. And this took a little bit of detective work on my part to figure out when she took her first flight. And she took her first flight in 1929 when she was the First Lady of New York State. She was asked to christen a research plane for a company that manufactured aeronautical equipment, and she agreed on one condition: no flight, no christening. And that day, she took a 20-minute ride in the skies over Albany. And Eleanor was friends with Amelia Earhart, and she wanted to be a pilot herself. This was not a woman who was going to be grounded at the White House. Within days of FDR's inauguration, Eleanor flew from Newark to Washington, D.C., and she was officially on record as the first president's wife to travel by air. Eleanor created for herself a unique role that combined her love of travel, the spirit of adventure she inherited from her father, with her sense of social responsibility. She decided that she could best help her husband, the president, by being his eyes and ears, his listening post, and by keeping him in touch with public opinion, which she said is the moving force in a democracy. Eleanor ceaselessly crisscrossed the country, giving speeches, inspecting New Deal initiatives, seeing and meeting people, and gathering information. And that information she used to exact change, either through her own means or by providing it to the president and his policy advisors. 1 year into his presidency, FDR asked Eleanor to go to Puerto Rico to investigate labor and living conditions. And the fact that she took a flight over water to get there cemented her reputation as fearless and unconventional. And around that time, she was featured on the cover of this general interest magazine and declared America's most traveled First Lady. In the accompanying article, it was reported that the nation, unaccustomed to First Ladies darting about, watched her with mingled admiration and alarm. Despite having the president's backing, Eleanor's intrepidness and her independence didn't sit well with everyone. In 1936, when FDR ran for a second term, Eleanor's travels were wielded as a political weapon by the opposition, and voters were assured that the Republican candidate's wife, Mrs. Alf Landon, was a traditional wife and mother who would stay at home. FDR won re-election in a landslide. As First Lady, Eleanor averaged an astounding 40,000 miles on the road each year. And yet, even for such an experienced traveler like Eleanor, the Pacific trip exceeded anything she had previously done. This time, she would be on the road longer than ever before, traveling farther and at a faster pace, covering more ground, enduring more discomforts, and facing danger. Eleanor was heading into a theater of war unlike any other in history, one where fighting took place across great distances over water and on islands with harsh terrain. Life magazine used these aerial views of a globe to show its readers how the Pacific Ocean sprawls across nearly half the planet, transforming the area into what they described as the vastest single battlefield over which man has ever fought. Eleanor traveled for 5 weeks and covered 25,000 miles, a distance roughly equal to the Earth's circumference. She went to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, through the South Pacific, and, at her insistence, into territory that was still under enemy air attack. Despite being an enthusiastic and an experienced traveler, Eleanor did something unusual before she set out for the Pacific. She left her jewelry, including her engagement ring, with her secretary for safekeeping. She had enough trepidation about this trip to leave instructions on what should be done with the jewelry in case she didn't return. And her secretary said that it gave her a strange feeling because Eleanor had never done this before leaving for any of her other trips. Eleanor predicted that the Pacific trip would cost her deeply, both physically and mentally, and in fact, this turned out to be true. Early on in the research process for the book, I came across something that Eleanor wrote in an autobiography 6 years after her trip to the Pacific, and she said, "The Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free." And I found that statement so powerful and haunting, and that she said it so many years later, and it really compelled me to uncover what she experienced during her time in the Pacific. So why did she do it? Why did she commit herself to such an arduous undertaking? Eleanor was enormously driven to contribute to the war effort, and she continually looked for ways to do that. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, what she most wanted to do was go abroad and work with the Red Cross, aiding people displaced by the turmoil. But Hitler's forces were advancing so swiftly that there was concern she could be taken captive, and the State Department denied her request. In May 1941, Eleanor became the first presidential spouse to hold an official government post. She joined the Office of Civilian Defense, which prepared communities across the country in case of an enemy attack. Eleanor was elated at having a specific wartime task. Her secretary said the gleam was back in her eye. Unfortunately, it was short-lived, and 5 months into the position, she resigned. Even though she worked unpaid, her fears that it would add fuel to the fire for critics in Congress and the press came true. And she wrote about her resignation in her column My Day, saying, "An individual, even if she is a president's wife, may have independent views and must be allowed the expression of an opinion. But actual participation in the work of the government, we are not yet able to accept." Eleanor was depressed and frustrated at once again not having a specific way to serve the war effort. And she was convinced that her association with the White House would prevent her from doing any real job in World War II. Then her journey to Great Britain proved differently. It was an important undertaking that was uniquely suited to her. She was world famous and well-renowned. She had the travel savvy, as well as the diplomatic skills, the people skills, the morale-building skills, and the reporting skills. The trip was a resounding success. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was impressed with the way that Eleanor charmed and bolstered the British people, telling her afterward, "You certainly have left golden footprints behind you." Eleanor's trip to the Pacific would draw on all those same skills, and it would require more endurance and courage, which was exactly the kind of wartime task she wanted. Eleanor especially felt a sense of obligation toward the generation of young men being sent into battle. And a primary reason for the trip was to thank US troops herself and on behalf of the president and to build morale. And in all, she addressed more than 400,000 troops throughout her time in the Pacific. The trip was also an informal diplomatic mission to allied nations Australia and New Zealand and to see the war work that women were doing in those countries. And Eleanor being Eleanor, she added even more onto her plate by going as a representative of the American Red Cross and inspecting the organization's facilities in the region. She packed no civilian clothing, and she wore only Red Cross uniforms during the trip, which pared down her clothing and helped her adhere to a strict luggage limit. I have it in common with Eleanor that we travel light. Furthermore, the trip occurred at a crucial time in the war. By the summer of 1943, the tide was turning in the Allies' favor in Europe and the Pacific. Eleanor felt that people were overly optimistic about the war's outcome and that they were becoming dangerously complacent. The trip would link the home front and the fighting front, reminding the nation that they could not give up on their duties until the war was won, and that any slackening in production risked the lives of the men on the distant battlefields. For security reasons, the trip was kept secret for the first 10 days as Eleanor made her way from island to island through the South Pacific. Her first inspection stop was a US Army outpost on Christmas Island, a speck of land so tiny she wondered why a large wave didn't come along and wash it away. Rumors were running rampant among the GIs on Christmas Island. They noticed that heightened security measures were being put in place, and they speculated that somebody important was coming to visit. They thought it might be a troop of chorus girls, or hoping it would be a troop of chorus girls, or perhaps the politician Wendell Willkie, who had recently made an around-the-world tour and written a best-selling book about it. They were expecting a VIP, and yet they were astounded when it was Eleanor Roosevelt who stepped off the plane. FDR specifically asked Eleanor to visit Christmas Island and other islands along the supply and communications route that linked the United States with Australia. It was vital to keep the route open and protected, and yet the men on these islands felt marginalized and distant from the fighting, and as if they weren't making enough of a contribution to the war. And FDR wanted Eleanor to assure them that he knew the valuable job they were doing. So on Christmas Island, Eleanor set the rigorous pace that she would keep throughout the trip. After she got back, she was giving a speech, and an audience member asked her how many hours of sleep she got per night while she was in the Pacific. She replied that she could get by on 5, but that she didn't always get them. She went nonstop the entire 5 weeks, sleeping on army cots in rustic huts, traveling by jeep over rough terrain to reach isolated camps, and doing things like climbing a lookout tower and getting an up-close look at a tank destroyer. She visited Red Cross clubs. She dined in mess halls, getting up at dawn to breakfast with servicemen, and she walked miles and miles of hospital wards. She inspected everything from laundry rooms to artillery headquarters to a dentist tent in the Australian outback where a serviceman was having a tooth removed without making a sound. He said afterward, "It hurt like hell, but with Mrs. Roosevelt watching, I had to act tough." Eleanor took every opportunity to speak with servicemen, finding out what they wanted and what they needed immediately and after the war. Eleanor was an expert at fact-gathering. During her visit to Great Britain, an American reporter wrote in a London newspaper, "The best thing to do with Eleanor is to go through the necessary formalities and then just turn her loose. She can be depended upon to see everything there is to see and meet everyone worth meeting." In Bora Bora, instead of breakfasting as expected in the officers' mess, Eleanor surprised down the ranks by eating with the enlisted men, and she borrowed mess gear from an awestruck young serviceman. The soldiers seated with Eleanor, this was not an uncommon occurrence, the soldiers seated with Eleanor were tongue-tied, until one brave GI spoke up and asked if FDR was planning to run again for president. Well, Eleanor couldn't answer that question, but the ice was broken, and then they proceeded to have a lively conversation about post-war jobs and education for servicemen. Not only is the First Lady in an active theater of war, she's reporting to the President and the home front while she's there. As First Lady, Eleanor achieved something else that was unique, building up an extensive network of outlets that she used to communicate with the American public, holding her famous women-only press conferences, giving speeches across the country, making radio addresses, and writing the 6-day-a-week syndicated newspaper column I mentioned earlier called My Day. And the strict luggage limit that I mentioned, part of the reason that Eleanor pared down her wardrobe by wearing the uniforms was because she lugged a heavy manual typewriter with her to the Pacific so that she could keep writing My Day in real time, and copy was wired to her editor in New York. Like every journalist, Eleanor had to adhere to wartime censorship rules, which were highly restrictive in the Pacific Theater. Any information that could aid the enemy was forbidden, such as the number of troops stationed at bases. She couldn't name and print all of the islands she visited or mention any geographic detail that might give away a location. One of her My Day columns transmitted from England attracted the notice of government censors because she referred to a secret place. And officials tried to contact Eleanor for input, but they had to go ahead and alter the copy because they said they couldn't catch up with her. She moves too fast. Eleanor wrote My Day for 26 years, beginning in 1935, and totaling about 8,000 columns that appeared in newspapers nationwide. It's because of My Day that I ended up writing the First Lady of World War II. While I was reading a collection of the columns, I came across a mention that she visited Australia during a tour of the Pacific Theater. It was a fleeting mention, but it immediately caught my attention because I had recently been to Australia and New Zealand. And I've always had an intense desire to travel, and this aspect of Eleanor's life as a traveler really resonated with me. And when I read in My Day that she had visited Australia, the first thought that struck me was amazement at the distance that she would have traveled to get there, and that she did it under wartime conditions. During World War II, Eleanor used My Day and her other platforms to support the war effort and to help guide the nation, from urging women to seek employment in the defense industry and the military, and helping to overcome the social stigma of doing so, to advocating for legislation to support servicemen. She promoted the buying of war bonds and donating to the Red Cross Blood Bank, which was a new nationwide program at the time. The blood was turned into dried plasma and sent to the front lines, where it was kept in foxholes for use during battle. As she had been doing her entire time as First Lady, Eleanor used the knowledge she gleaned to advise on issues that otherwise might not have been known or fully understood. An example of this is how she helped prepare the nation for the fact that men would be returning home with disabilities in greater numbers than ever before. And to do this, she shared the story of a soldier she met on Christmas Island who had his leg amputated after he was pinned beneath an overturned tank. Due to advances in medicine, like having blood plasma at the ready, if troops didn't die outright in battle, chances were they would live, and albeit with physical disabilities. And Eleanor advised the nation that they needed to treat these men not with pity, but with helpfulness and understanding. And this is actually just one of the instances where I found that she was really guiding the nation on psychological issues like that. Eleanor used her platforms to buoy home front morale and to admonish when necessary, such as chastising Americans for believing enemy propaganda and doing Hitler's work for him. Eleanor also used My Day to help maintain the secrecy of the Pacific trip. For the first 10 days of the trip, she had pre-written columns, and the byline listed her location as being at home in Hyde Park, New York. Eleanor continued to make her way through the South Pacific until she reached the island of New Caledonia, where she ran into a roadblock. That roadblock was Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Forces, and the man who would solely decide whether she was allowed to visit the island of Guadalcanal, which was her ultimate goal of the trip, and it was still on the front lines. Admiral Halsey was not pleased to have Eleanor in the Pacific. He had nothing against her personally. He liked her, he admired her. What he didn't like were VIPs traipsing through his area and taking his focus away from the war, especially because he thought these visits were superficial PR junkets or political gestures. All very practical reasons that he objected, along with the fact that he would have to put on a tie. When Eleanor arrived at his headquarters, Admiral Halsey brusquely shut down the suggestion of her going to Guadalcanal, telling her, "Guadalcanal is no place for you, ma'am." He did make a slight concession, saying that he would wait to make a final decision until after Eleanor visited Australia and New Zealand and returned to New Caledonia, and he would see what the status was of a current battle he was overseeing and whether he had the fighter planes available to escort her into Guadalcanal. Well, Eleanor was devastated at this immediate shutting down of her request, and she left for New Zealand in really low spirits because she thought, given this initial reception, there was no way Admiral Halsey was going to agree to her going to Guadalcanal. After 10 days of secrecy, Eleanor landed in New Zealand and news broke about the trip. There wasn't so much surprise that she turned up on the other side of the world, but that it had been such a well-kept secret. When Eleanor arrived in New Zealand, it was nighttime in Washington, D.C., and the switchboard at the White House began lighting up as reporters scrambled for the story. There was a deluge of media coverage, and, of course, as with most of Eleanor's undertakings, controversy erupted. There was praise for what she was doing, and there was criticism. Newspaper editorials took sides, and people wrote to their local papers for and against Eleanor and the trip. The New York Herald Tribune ran side-by-side contrasting letters. One was from someone who lauded Eleanor, and the other was signed by disgusted citizen who demanded a congressional investigation into her activities. Detractors used the Pacific trip to criticize the Roosevelt administration and to attack Eleanor personally. They questioned whether she had the right to wear a Red Cross uniform, an allegation the organization publicly refuted. Eleanor was a longtime supporter of the Red Cross, and she had been invited to wear the uniform as part of her inspection duties. Critics blasted the use of taxpayer money, which was deliberate misinformation because it was widely reported that Eleanor paid for the trip herself, including purchasing the Red Cross uniforms. Eleanor also donated the money that she earned from writing columns and articles about the Pacific trip to the Red Cross and another aid organization. Critics blasted the use of fuel, when in fact Eleanor flew commercial from New York to San Francisco and then on a regular flight of the Air Transport Command. She basically hitched a ride on the transport plane. And everywhere they went, the plane delivered mail and supplies and took along personnel who were being relocated. Eleanor's stop in Rotorua, the home of the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, got racists riled up in the United States. They were especially angry that she received a traditional Maori greeting, which was a pressing of noses, a gesture akin to shaking hands. And a congressman even ranted about it on the floor of the House of Representatives. And while Eleanor was in the Pacific, Alabama Governor Chauncey Sparks announced that he was going to denounce her at the forthcoming Democratic National Convention while pushing a platform of white supremacy. Eleanor was often asked if the criticism she received troubled her or if it was hurtful or made her angry. She directly addressed the issue in an article titled "How to Take Criticism," published in Ladies' Home Journal. And ultimately she concluded, and these are her words, "You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So you may as well do what you think is right and what you believe in." Among Eleanor's detractors were the traditionalists still lamenting not having a more conventional first lady. And some of these people wrote directly to the president to gripe about Eleanor, like Mr. and Mrs. George Rogers of Atlanta, who sent this telegram asking FDR to confine Eleanor more to the White House. I figure FDR probably had a good laugh over this one. Eleanor's unconventionality is one of the things that the New Zealand and Australian newspapers celebrated. Eleanor was familiar to New Zealanders and Australians because of news coverage during her time as First Lady, and her reputation as an advocate for social justice preceded her. A New Zealand newspaper said at the time of her visit, "Mrs. Roosevelt is frequently described as the world's foremost female political force. She is the wife of a ruler, but her power comes from her influence, not on him, but on public opinion. It is essentially a self-made influence. No other president's wife has exercised anything like the same power either in her own land or in the world without. Eleanor was a presence on the global stage during World War II and a voice to the Allied nations. She made 3 wartime trips overseas to Great Britain, the Pacific, and a year later to the Caribbean area. She was asked to make morale-raising radio addresses to women in Sweden, Brazil, France, and other countries. Another New Zealand newspaper called Eleanor a great fighter in the cause of the world's freedom. They were particularly impressed that she was perhaps the only woman at whom Hitler screamed his denunciations. For years, Eleanor had been publicly speaking out against Hitler and Nazi aggression, and the Nazis noticed. A German newspaper threatened her by name, and Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, "Mrs. Roosevelt is shooting her mouth off around the country. If she were my wife, it would be a different story." Well, thankfully, she wasn't his wife. She was FDR's wife, and he supported what she was doing. Eleanor and FDR mutually decided that she would travel to the Pacific. And at the FDR library is an extensive file with original materials pertaining to the trip. It's like a time capsule with everything from itineraries and a mileage log to formal dinner seating charts, correspondence, and a diary Eleanor kept. The diary was one of the ways that she and FDR stayed in touch. She wrote it in real time using the typewriter she took along, and it was shared in installments with the president. And one of the items I especially love in the Pacific Trip file is this memo on the right from FDR to Eleanor's secretary. "Dear Malvina, I think these first installment diaries are grand. Don't forget to let me see the rest of them." While Eleanor was in New Zealand, she addressed an audience of 2,000 women in Wellington. A reporter who was in attendance said that standing on stage, silhouetted in a glow of light in the darkened theater, that Eleanor seemed like a modern crusader and her weapons were a microphone and a typewriter. The inner journey that brought Eleanor to the stage in Wellington was a transformation from a shy society matron whose grandmother once told her, "A woman's place is not in the public eye," to becoming an international figure so renowned and respected that she and what she stood for was a threat to the Axis. During Eleanor's visit to Great Britain, Joseph Goebbels warned German journalists, telling them the hullabaloo about Eleanor Roosevelt should be left to die down gradually and should not result in Mrs. Roosevelt's journey being popularized or invested with a certain importance. Probably much to his dismay, the hullabaloo was even greater during Eleanor's time in the Pacific than it was in Great Britain. So it was pretty much a losing battle for the propagandists. The media coverage during Eleanor's time in the Pacific was massive in part because her visit to Australia and New Zealand was a historic event. She was the first US president's wife to visit, and that she traveled there during wartime made it even more impressive to them. Eleanor's visit generated a level of excitement that was on par with royalty, even blocking traffic in Sydney. This clipping is from a scrapbook sent to Eleanor by the New Zealand government commemorating the trip. So some old-timers in Australia's capital, Canberra, thought that Eleanor being there even eclipsed the excitement of a royal visit. With a notable difference, they loved her informality. And the Australians in particular cheered whenever Eleanor broke with protocol. Like when she arrived at a government building and she broke away from the official party to walk across the grounds and speak with a group of women in uniform who were part of the Women's Land Army, which was created during wartime to address labor shortages in the agricultural sector. Or the time Eleanor visited a cannery that prepared food for the troops, and she stood on a table in the dining hall to address the women who worked there. One of the most informal and delightful parties Eleanor attended was with US Army and Navy nurses at a Red Cross club in Sydney, where she spent a very happy half hour talking with them about their experiences serving in New Guinea. In addition to the physical and mental rigors of caring for the wounded and the constant threat of air raids, there were other challenges: rats absconding with socks, waking up to find snakes curled beside a bed's mosquito netting, and always damp clothing due to the humidity. Eleanor told My Day readers that everyone at home owed a debt of gratitude to the nurses in the Pacific. They are not living very comfortably, she said. They are seeing daily sights that must try their fortitude, and yet she never heard a single one complain. Eleanor told My Day readers that if she were young enough, she would like to have been a nurse in the Army or Navy because they most closely shared the men's experiences. Part of the reason Eleanor had been invited to New Zealand and Australia was to see the war work that women were doing in factories and the armed forces. They were performing a greater variety of jobs than women in the United States, where the manpower shortage was less acute. Here is Eleanor at a laboratory in Wellington that performed high-precision work on optical munitions. At a Ford factory that produced grenades, mortar bombs, and other weaponry, more than 100 women paused what they were doing when Eleanor entered their workroom and spontaneously cheered. Women were employed at the Ford factory for the first time and made up the majority of employees. Girls who were doing a man-sized job, according to the company. Or as Eleanor described it in My Day, doing dangerous work and doing it well and with considerable skill. As Eleanor traveled through New Zealand and Australia, she had a dual task: rallying people to see the war through to its conclusion and looking ahead and preparing for peace. She had a message for women in particular. Regardless of where they found their place after the war, returning to their homes or continuing in the workforce, they needed to be involved in civic life, to use their voice and the power of their vote and not sit idly by while men alone determine the fates of their countries. Go, Eleanor. Just as women broke new ground while helping to win the war, they needed to play a greater part in the post-war era to help build and maintain a peaceful world. After leaving Australia, Eleanor went off the grid again for security reasons, and the flight number was changed to 246. Eleanor returned to Admiral Halsey's headquarters on New Caledonia, where she received some great news. She was going to Guadalcanal. Why the change of heart on Admiral Halsey's part? Eleanor won his support not by making arguments, but by the power of her example. Through his own observations, along with reports from other military personnel and a tremendous amount of press coverage, he saw that her motivation was genuine and that the trip was no superficial PR junket. Eleanor Roosevelt was the real deal. Admiral Halsey later admitted to being sorry for his original surliness, and allowing Eleanor to go to Guadalcanal was a sign of respect for her. Also, Admiral Halsey was shrewd. If all went well while Eleanor was on Guadalcanal, it would generate good publicity. And you need good publicity to keep public approval high for the war and to keep funding flowing. But ultimately, what it came down to, and why I think he allowed her to go to Guadalcanal, was that morale wins wars, and he could see the uplifting effect that her presence had on the troops. Here is this gruff, tough admiral, and he said what he marveled at most were the expressions on the men's faces as Eleanor leaned over them in their hospital beds. He said most people came through his area, glanced into a sun parlor at a hospital, and left. Eleanor, meanwhile, went bed to bed comforting the wounded. And Admiral Halsey knew the importance of that. When he took over command of Guadalcanal, he visited the front lines as soon as he could. And on his way back to his headquarters, he stopped on another island to visit a naval hospital, where he went bed to bed talking with injured servicemen. It not only buoyed their morale, it buoyed the morale of the men on Guadalcanal when they heard about it. Part of what made Eleanor so successful was her extraordinary ability to connect with people, whether it was the Prime Minister of New Zealand or a wounded young soldier she met at a hospital in Australia. When she reached this young man's bedside, he handed her a long letter. She took out her glasses, she put them on, and she read the entire thing. She could see that this young man was distressed, and she ordered everyone, medical personnel, reporters, and the high-ranking officers who insisted on following her around, to go wait in the corridor while she spoke to this young man alone. And this is one instance out of many that illustrates Eleanor's caring about the servicemen on an individual level. A practice Eleanor began in Great Britain was to keep logbooks of the wounded servicemen she met. And in these logbooks, she recorded each person's name, his injuries, and where and how he received them, such as Second Lieutenant Leroy Mitchell, a bombardier in a P-17 who had a ruptured eye from being shot in the face during an attack by Japanese fighter planes in the skies over Papua New Guinea. Also recorded in the logbooks was the name and address of a family member for Eleanor to contact after her return. And she did contact the families. Letters took weeks to get to the Pacific and back, and to have recent firsthand news of your loved one from the First Lady of the United States was extraordinary. Although Eleanor called one serviceman's girlfriend and she hung up on her because she didn't believe it was the First Lady calling and she thought she was being pranked. So now, Admiral Halsey is fully on board with Eleanor's visit to Guadalcanal, and any misgivings that he still had about her going were solely out of concern for her safety. Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was the site of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War. The stakes were high and the headlines were blunt. Jungle Island becomes the heart of great battle for the Pacific, and Solomon's battle vital to allies. Newspapers reported daily on the progress of the fighting, and Eleanor and the rest of the nation closely tracked what was happening on Guadalcanal. Finally, after 6 months of unfathomable hardship, the Japanese were defeated on what they called Death Island, and they relinquished control of Guadalcanal. Visiting Guadalcanal was a tribute Eleanor felt she owed to the men in uniform, to see where so many had lost their lives or received their injuries. Eleanor's respect for the troops' sacrifices was deeply personal. All 4 of her sons were serving in various branches of the military on active duty, including her son James, a Marine who fought in the Solomon Islands campaign. Visiting Guadalcanal was also a personal test for Eleanor. She was concerned that she would be perceived as lacking courage if she weren't permitted to go. She told Franklin, "I simply never will face another hospital at home, for I will always feel that the men are thinking I was afraid if I do not go." In the early morning hours, under cover of darkness, Eleanor left for Guadalcanal in a heavily gunned U.S. Navy bomber, which flew with lights out to evade detection. She sat on a makeshift seat over the bomb bay, ears ringing and shivering in the dark. Despite the difficulties of the 3-hour ride, Eleanor was elated at achieving her goal. As the bomber closed in on Guadalcanal, 6 fighter planes appeared to escort it the rest of the way. As it turns out, Admiral Halsey's concerns about Eleanor's safety were warranted. Guadalcanal was bombed several nights before and after her visit, leading him to speculate whether the Japanese also had code breakers. In the diary Eleanor kept, she described an air raid alert that sounded while she was on Guadalcanal. And along with the hospital staff and the ambulatory patients, she was taken to an underground shelter to wait for the all clear. Well, after the all clear sounded, she didn't miss a beat, and she got right back to business going through the hospital wards. The danger associated with the trip didn't faze Eleanor. Even traveling in a military transport plane for 5 weeks was risky, as they weren't the most reliable aircraft. To save time, rather than design transport planes from scratch, the military modified heavy bombers. One pilot bluntly described a converted bomber to transport plane as an evil bastard contraption. The year before Eleanor went to the Pacific, a man named Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, a famous World War I pilot, was asked by the Secretary of War to travel to the Pacific and deliver a confidential verbal message to General MacArthur at his headquarters in Australia. Well, the navigation equipment in the transport plane that Captain Rickenbacker was traveling in malfunctioned, and they missed a refueling stop, an island that was originally on Eleanor's itinerary, and their plane was ditched in the Pacific. Captain Rickenbacker and some other survivors were finally spotted and rescued after they spent 24 days on a raft floating in the ocean. On Eleanor's return home, the planned route was changed at the last minute because of reports of Japanese aircraft in the area for retaliatory raids. Eleanor had courage in spades, and as I said, the danger didn't concern her. What greatly impacted her was the massive scale of suffering she witnessed. She said one sees the results of the war in the hospitals. Eleanor was a class act when she was going through the hospital wards, bed to bed, offering words of comfort or a joke. But she said that inside she was burning with resentment at what was being done to these young men. A particularly emotional experience for Eleanor was visiting a cemetery on Guadalcanal, walking along the rows and rows of graves, many of which were adorned with handmade crosses and mementos left by servicemen for their fallen friends. Eleanor wrote in my day, "You think of the women's hearts buried here as well, and are grateful for signs everywhere that show the boys are surrounded by affection." She went on to tell her readers, "I have seen many a boy hospitalized because he went back for a buddy who was wounded. When you try to tell them of your admiration for their courage, they seem embarrassed. One boy said, "Shucks, you would do the same, wouldn't you?" All you can say is, "I hope so." Afterwards, Eleanor often thought about the cemetery on Guadalcanal, particularly when she heard somebody spewing bigotry. As soon as they started to speak, she would envision the cemetery, where men of varying nationalities, races, religions, and backgrounds who once fought side by side now laid together in death. Eleanor was extremely forthright when reporting back to the American public and making them understand the human cost of the war. In a radio address after her return from the Pacific, she told of a young man she met in a first-line hospital, so recently injured that he was still in the set of bandages from when he fell in battle. In that same address, she told people to stop complaining about food rationing and shortages because it was nothing compared to lying on your back in a jungle swamp while an enemy camouflaged in the trees took shots at you. In another speech, she recalled the shadowed eyes of the men who had endured the savagery of jungle warfare. And Eleanor went to great lengths to understand jungle warfare, which was a new type of fighting for American servicemen. She had a reputation for wanting to see things for herself, and that's exactly what she did, even trekking through the jungle on a training exercise. She wished she had seen the training before answering a letter she received from a serviceman's mother. This woman was outraged that her son was being trained in the Louisiana swamps, which she thought was cruel and unnecessary. And Eleanor said, "I might have been able to explain to her that it was for her son's own safety in the future." Eleanor's final stop in the Pacific was Honolulu. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was the first public figure to address the nation. She was scheduled to broadcast her weekly radio show that same evening, and she went on the air as planned, giving an update about what was happening behind the scenes in Washington and offering an encouraging message to the American people. "Despite a clutch of fear at your heart," she told them, "I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears." This is Eleanor on the USS Oklahoma, a battleship that was torpedoed and sank at Pearl Harbor, taking 429 sailors down with her. At the time of Eleanor's visit, the Oklahoma had been raised from the harbor floor and it was being held upright with cables, but it was not yet afloat. Today, a memorial at Pearl Harbor is inscribed with a prayer Eleanor carried in her wallet throughout the war. "Dear Lord, lest I continue my complacent way, help me to remember, somehow out there, a man died for me today. As long as there be war, I then must ask and answer, am I worth dying for?" As Eleanor predicted, the Pacific trip took a huge physical and emotional toll on her. She lost 30 pounds while she was overseas, and when she came home, she fell into a deep depression. A close friend of hers explained it by saying, as long as she had to keep going, her iron will carried her through, in spite of her deep horror at what she saw and the great sadness at the continued bloodshed and dying. As Time magazine pointed out, no other U.S. mother had seen so much of the panorama of the war, had been closer to the sweat and boredom, the suffering. And yet the Pacific trip made Eleanor determined to work even harder, to see the war through and to strive for peace so that this carnage never happened again. A near-term goal was to see a support program established for returning servicemen. During all of the conversations with servicemen that Eleanor had in mess halls and Red Cross clubs throughout the Pacific, the things she heard most were that they needed supplies to win the war and they wanted opportunities for jobs and education when they returned home. And Eleanor used the power of her public platform to help ensure that this was done, bringing pressure to bear on Congress. Legislation needed to be passed immediately and not after the war ended, both to assist the great number of men already returning and to boost the morale of those still on the fighting front. As a soldier explained to Eleanor, and she shared this in my day, they weren't afraid of being killed or maimed. What they were afraid of is that when they finally returned home and began to piece their lives back together, that they would be made to feel like suckers for the sacrifices they had made. The GI Bill of Rights was signed into law the next year. One of the most telling instances about the validity of Eleanor's trip to the Pacific was Admiral Halsey completely changing his mind about her being there, and he was not inclined to change his mind easily. He said, She alone accomplished more good than any other person or any group of civilians who passed through my area. And he was far from the only one who had a changed attitude after encountering Eleanor. A soldier wrote in a letter home, "I have always been against her until now, but she has the faculty of seeming as though she is not in the slightest hurry, that she came all the way out here just to talk to you and you and you." Another convert was Captain Robert White, who initially complained about being assigned to the U.S. Army entourage that escorted Eleanor throughout Australia. After nearly 2 weeks, 3,000 miles, and countless stops at hospitals and other facilities, Captain White had a radically different view. He wrote in a letter to his wife, "Mrs. Roosevelt is certainly one of the most brilliant and competent individuals I ever met. I no longer think of her as the wife of the president, but rather as a highly efficient and perfectly competent public official." When Captain White and his fellow servicemen arrived in Australia, they expected to make quick work of the war and return home right away. But after more than a year overseas, the United States had evolved into a distant dreamland, and the men lived for letters from loved ones. "In short, we are lonesome," said Captain White. "We don't admit it. We like to cover it up with fast chatter, quips, and bravado, but underneath we all know the truth." This was the scene into which Eleanor arrived. Troops knew of her as the First Lady, as a columnist, and as a Washington socialite. "She may be all these things," said Captain White, "but over here she was something more, something none of us had seen in over a year, an American mother." At an airfield in Australia, Captain White stood with a group of Army men as Flight 246 taxied down the runway with Eleanor aboard. As the plane took off, a sergeant mused aloud, "Damn, she's fine, isn't she?" Among Eleanor's biggest supporters were the soldiers on Christmas Island. And when the inevitable controversy erupted over Eleanor's trip, they took on her detractors in their troop publication. A GI journalist reported, "Her kindness and consideration brought this island of forgotten men very much back to life." Another said, "It takes great courage to do what Mrs. Roosevelt is now doing, and you have to hand it to her. She has what it takes." During the dozen years Eleanor spent as First Lady, upending tradition and breaking new ground, her journey to the front lines powerfully illustrates how dramatically she transformed the role. The Pacific trip exemplifies so much of what is admired about Eleanor Roosevelt: her courage, her compassion, her connections with people, her crusading for a better world, and it shows how important her leadership was during World War II. A reporter at the time described Eleanor's trip to the Pacific, and I believe this still stands, as the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made. Thank you so much for listening.